The principal slammed the test on her desk in front of the whole class. Let's see if diversity got you here. Or just luck. Jania's hands froze. Every eye watching. Every whisper slicing through her like glass. A camera clicked from the corner, recording her humiliation like an exhibit. But what she did next, no one, not even Harwood, could have seen coming. And that video? It didn't just go viral, it burned the system to the ground. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning Jania Brooks stepped through the iron gates of Roosevelt High. The air felt sharper than the late September chill should have allowed. Students drifted across the immaculate courtyard with the casual ease of people who had always known they belonged there. Their uniforms were crisp, their shoes unscuffed, their laughter suspended in a space where legacy mattered more than merit, and lineage shaped opportunity long before talent was given a chance. Jania felt that difference press against her chest the moment her sneakers touched the pavement. She was the outsider the admissions board had framed as a beacon of diversity. But she knew from the careful glances directed her way that the students saw something else entirely. They saw an intrusion. She kept her shoulders square as she walked, carrying a backpack her mother saved 3 paychecks to buy before passing away 6 months earlier. The grief still settled in her lungs each morning before school, heavy and slow-moving, but she pushed it down with the same determination she carried everywhere. Her acceptance into Roosevelt High had been her mother's last dream spoken aloud. Her mother believed the world might see her differently once she entered a place that promised futures, not survival. Yet the truth felt far less hopeful, as she crossed the courtyard alone, following the map the school had mailed to her, trying to locate her first classroom. Before she could, a voice crackled across the outdoor speaker system with unexpected authority. The principal was calling her by name, asking her to report to the main office immediately. Students paused mid-step, eyes tightening, some curious, some already judging. The sound of her name echoing across the courtyard made her feel as if her presence required correction. That single public announcement made her visible in a way she had not consented to. She swallowed and kept walking, moving through the maze of manicured hedges and polished brick walls toward the administrative wing. The office doors towered above her, glass thick enough to distort reflections. On the other side of the desk, Principal Richard Harwood waited with an expression that suggested he had long grown tired of pretending neutrality. His suit jacket was fitted too tightly across his shoulders, his hair parted with the precision of a man who believed rules were best enforced when he appeared flawless. He dismissed the secretary with a small nod and gestured for Jania to step farther into the room. Nothing about him felt welcoming. His eyes assessed her the way an evaluator observes a test subject, detached, already forming conclusions before evidence is presented. Without using words that could be repeated against him, he communicated everything he believed about her. He spoke of academic standards and behavioral expectations with an emphasis on the fact that students from her background tended to struggle. He referenced performance concerns that had never existed because he had reviewed her file, not to understand her, but to search for weaknesses. He highlighted her scholarship so pointedly that the distinction between opportunity and charity blurred into a subtle accusation. She realized in that moment that in his eyes, she was not a student but an experiment. The office felt colder as he continued speaking. She listened quietly, refusing to let her breathing falter. Her mother once said that survival sometimes meant learning how to endure condescension without allowing the person delivering it to touch your spirit. She held on to that as Harwood shifted from warnings to something far more unnerving. He mentioned a monitoring process designed to ensure she remained on track. The implication hung between them like a weight. She would be watched in ways others were not. Her achievements would not be celebrated. They would be scrutinized. When he finally dismissed her, she stepped into the hallway feeling as if every student she passed already knew something she did not. The whispering resumed immediately. Conversations shifted the moment she approached, eyes flicking toward her with calculated restraint. She sensed curiosity coated with prejudice, the kind of gaze that lingered until it found a flaw it could claim as confirmation. The walls of Roosevelt High were lined with portraits of alumni who had gone on to elite universities and powerful careers. None of them looked like her. She wondered how many black students ever reached those walls and what they endured to get there. She walked to her first class trying to shake off the weight of that meeting, but something inside her had already shifted. The hallways no longer felt like neutral pathways. They felt like corridors of expectation she had not agreed to carry. Yet she kept moving, reminding herself why she was here. She wanted to build something brighter than the circumstances she was born into. She wanted to honor a mother who worked double shifts in silence, so that her child could dream loudly. When the lunch bell rang, she expected the day to soften, to give her a moment of breath after the morning's tension. Instead, a student aide hurried toward her with a message from Principal Harwood. She was instructed to report to the library immediately for a baseline assessment. Confusion knotted inside her, but she followed the directive, ignoring the ripple of murmurs rising around her as she walked. The library was hushed, its long tables arranged with military precision. Harwood was already there, standing beside a stack of papers clipped together. A teacher hovered nearby with a school-issued tablet, ready to record something. The air carried the sterile scent of disinfectant, as though the space had been sanitized not for health but for control. Harwood greeted her with professional stiffness, placing the packet in front of her as though presenting evidence in a trial. He informed her the assessment was necessary to determine her academic placement. No other student was being tested. No other freshman had been summoned from lunch. She understood immediately. This was not an evaluation. This was an exposure. The packet contained advanced material far beyond freshman level. Entire pages were filled with concepts she had never studied. Questions she could not answer even if she had spent the entire summer preparing. The intention was unmistakable. Harwood wanted proof she did not belong here. He wanted data to justify a belief he had already formed. Her heart pounded, but she maintained her composure, reminding herself that humiliation only held power if she surrendered to it. She lifted her pencil and began working through the questions she recognized, refusing to let fear dictate the pace of her hands. As she wrote, she felt the tablet's camera pointed at her, capturing every flinch, every hesitation. Somewhere behind her, students lingered outside the door, peeking in as if witnessing a spectacle. The school had turned her education into an exhibition, yet she refused to shrink. She filled every line she could, analyzing, thinking, refusing to give up even when the difficulty intensified. The test was designed to break her spirit, but she realized that if she let it, she would be allowing Harwood to define her future before she had even begun. She finished the packet with deliberate calm, sliding it across the table. Harwood took it without acknowledgement, his expression unreadable, almost disappointed she had not appeared defeated. As she walked out of the library, she felt eyes trailing her, not out of admiration but out of the hunger people have when waiting for someone else to fail. But failure was not what followed. Later that evening, long after she had returned home, long after she attempted to quiet her racing thoughts, a notification began spreading across social media platforms faster than she could comprehend. A video recorded inside the Roosevelt Library had leaked. The footage showed her sitting alone at the table, the camera angled to emphasize a narrative she had not consented to. The caption implied she was being tested to expose dishonesty in her admission. It was cruel, invasive, and humiliating. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of mocking her, viewers felt outrage. They recognized the predatory nature of the test, the imbalance of power, the isolation of a single black girl in a school determined to undermine her. Comments flooded in condemning the administration. The narrative Harwood hoped to build was collapsing before he could control it. And then, the next morning, as the school prepared for another day, Harwood appeared at the front door, holding another sealed envelope in his hand. He announced that this next assessment would be administered immediately, only to her. Only this time, it would be far worse. Harwood announces a surprise assessment, a baseline aptitude test, but only hands it to Jania. As the bell rang to mark the beginning of the lunch period, Jania didn't head toward the cafeteria like the rest of her classmates. Instead, she made her way back to the library, her heart pounding harder with each step. Her stomach was empty, but she couldn't feel the hunger through the tension building in her chest. Principal Harwood had made it clear. This was not optional. This baseline test wasn't listed on any syllabus, wasn't part of any academic plan. It was sudden, unlogged, and entirely directed at her. An unsanctioned gatekeeping, disguised as school policy. The door to the library was slightly ajar when she arrived. Inside, the lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the rows of books. A single table had been pulled forward, placed deliberately under the brightest ceiling light in the center of the room, as if it were a stage. There was no other student in sight. Only Ms. Alden, a stone-faced literature teacher with a reputation for compliance, stood nearby with a district-issued tablet in her hand, its camera already pointed at the chair where Jania was expected to sit. Harwood was standing a few feet away, holding a thick packet of papers that looked more like an advanced placement entrance exam than any freshman-level material. His expression remained unreadable, but the intent behind his presence was clear. This wasn't about her learning potential. It was about controlling the narrative. Without a word, he dropped the packet in front of her. She looked down and felt her stomach twist. There were questions on quantum mechanics, obscure literary references from graduate-level texts, complex calculus equations that required knowledge far beyond what a ninth grader would even begin to study. This wasn't just challenging, it was built to ensure failure, a psychological trap dressed up as a scholarly evaluation. She could feel it now, like a net tightening around her. Not just in the questions, but in the way the room had been arranged. Her chair had no back support. The light above was harsh. Even the silence felt oppressive, broken only by the faint buzzing of the tablet recording her every twitch and hesitation. She sat down and began. The pencil felt heavier in her hand than usual. The first page alone made it clear. She wasn't supposed to succeed. Every question was designed to expose her gaps, highlight her confusion, and reduce her to a stereotype. Harwood didn't want answers. He wanted proof. Proof that she was a mistake, an exception that should have never been admitted. Still, she refused to surrender to that plan. Her fingers tightened on the pencil. She circled the questions she could engage with. For the ones she couldn't, she showed her process, wrote out what she remembered from late-night YouTube tutorials she used to self-study. Every line she filled was an act of resistance. But even resistance had its price. As the clock ticked forward, the pressure mounted. Her eyes strained. Her breathing became shallow. The silence was no longer neutral. It was the sound of being watched. Miss Alden never looked away from the screen. Occasionally, Harwood shifted his weight behind her. The sound of his shoe against the carpet, a steady reminder that he wasn't just testing her intelligence. He was measuring her unraveling. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Her pencil tip broke. Her hand began to crack, but she didn't stop. Not because she had hope the test was fair, but because she refused to let him see defeat. By the end, her palms were damp, the paper smudged with the sweat of trying too hard under scrutiny. She slid the packet back across the table. Exhausted, Harwood didn't offer a word of feedback. He nodded once to Miss Alden, who tapped the screen and ended the recording. Without glancing back, he walked out of the room, the door clicking behind him. Jania remained seated for a moment longer, eyes on the library's high-arched ceiling, fighting back the sting of humiliation. It wasn't the test that broke her. It was knowing that every adult in that room had agreed to participate in her dehumanization. Outside the library, whispers already floated through the halls. Word spread fast. By sixth period, students were talking openly about the pop quiz for the scholarship girl. Some joked that she was getting special treatment. Others murmured that Harwood was finally putting her in her place. Someone had apparently seen the tablet recording her and claimed the footage would be used at a school board meeting to justify tighter admissions rules. Jania heard her name twisted into cruel nicknames as she walked down the hall, eyes forward, heart closed. But something strange happened that evening. As she sat at home, head resting on her desk, still staring at the textbook pages she could no longer absorb, her phone lit up with a notification, then another, and another. A video had just been posted on a student-run Roosevelt gossip page. At first glance, she thought it was just another humiliating meme, another edit designed to embarrass her further. But it wasn't edited. It was raw footage. The camera angle was high, taken from the corner of the library, clearly from the tablet Miss Alden had held. It showed Jania sitting alone, under the harsh light, the test packet thick in front of her. There was no sound, only captions added by whoever leaked the video. This is what they do when they don't want you to succeed. The video zoomed in slowly on her hands, trembling as she wrote. The caption continued, Imagine being told you're not good enough before you even begin. It didn't take long for the video to spread beyond Roosevelt. Within hours, it had reached Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok. Influencers with millions of followers reposted it with commentary on educational discrimination. Civil rights activists began tagging the district. Comments flooded in from around the country. Black students sharing their own stories of being singled out, over-tested, under-trusted. Educators criticized the misuse of assessments. Parents from all backgrounds called it abuse. The story had gone national, and yet, the school remained silent. Harwood didn't release a statement. The district avoided reporters. The students at Roosevelt were warned not to speak to the media. But screenshots of the test questions began leaking from someone inside. Advanced-level content far beyond what was expected of a freshman. People compared them to Ivy League entrance exams. More fuel to the fire. What Harwood had intended as a quiet public shaming had turned into something he could no longer control. Still inside Jania's home, the mood wasn't triumphant. Her aunt, who had taken her in after her mother's passing, was anxious. She knew how quickly the tide of public opinion could shift. She worried about retaliation, about the long-term cost of being the face of a controversy at such a young age. Jania didn't argue. She felt the weight of all of it. Her story was no longer hers. It had become a symbol, a talking point, a headline. But it still hurt. That night, as she sat awake long past midnight, she checked the video one last time. It had surpassed 1 million views. The comments were still flooding in. Then she noticed something different. A new post, buried in a comment thread, from an anonymous user. It read, "He's done this before, check the emails." Beneath it was a PDF link. The video goes viral, but not for the reason Harwood hoped. Someone just exposed a file that could unravel everything. The internet didn't wait. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't need context. The moment Jania's video surfaced beyond the Roosevelt gossip circuit, the collective outrage ignited like gasoline on dry pavement. The clip of a lone black girl being filmed while taking an impossible exam under a white principal's supervision struck a nerve deeper than most could have anticipated. It wasn't just about the test anymore. It was about the history it echoed. About every moment a young black student had been put on trial in a classroom meant to uplift, and instead used as a crucible to punish them for existing. Within hours, 3 hashtags surged to the top of Twitter's trending list. Now Leather Learn, Not Your Experiment, and Expose Harwood. What had started as a quiet injustice in the halls of one elite high school now had the attention of the entire nation. Teachers in urban districts shared their own stories of how black students were disproportionately disciplined. Students from private schools posted anonymously about unwritten codes that shaped who got extra help and who got warnings. It wasn't just about Jania anymore, but she had become the face of something long buried under polished brochures and diversity statements that meant nothing in practice. The footage continued to spread, shared by celebrities, civil rights attorneys, education reform advocates, and former students of Roosevelt High. One alumna, now a professor at a major university, tweeted that she had once been docked a recommendation letter by Principal Harwood after reporting racial bullying. Others revealed a disturbing pattern. Harwood had routinely questioned the legitimacy of black students' academic performance, often pushing them toward remedial tracks regardless of their grades. Some even described scholarship offers being quietly withdrawn after their parents questioned curriculum bias. These were stories no one had felt safe enough to share, until now. But while the public elevated Jania's strength as a symbol of dignity under pressure, inside her small home, things didn't feel dignified. They felt tense, fragile. Her aunt, Rosa, had been watching the media storm unfold with increasing anxiety. As the hashtags surged, so did the calls. Reporters requesting interviews, district officials doing damage control, family friends either rallying with support or urging silence to avoid further conflict. Rosa was proud of her niece's courage, but afraid of what came next. She knew how institutions protected their own. She knew Harwood would not stay silent for long. Jania, meanwhile, barely slept. The fame felt surreal and disconnected. People saw strength in her face during the test, but they hadn't seen her collapse onto her bed afterward, or heard the quiet sobs she'd muffled into her pillow so Rosa wouldn't hear. It wasn't the pressure that broke her. It was the exposure. The way strangers now felt entitled to her story, her trauma, her name. She wasn't ashamed, but she felt stolen from. Like her life had become a case study for people who would scroll past her pain by next week. And yet she couldn't look away either. Not after what she found in that anonymous comment the night before. The link in the post wasn't just a bluff. It led to a PDF 22 pages of internal school emails, typed with timestamps and employee signatures. They were scanned copies, possibly from someone on the inside, and they were damning. One email, dated just 2 weeks before school began, showed Harwood forwarding her scholarship paperwork with a note that read, "Keep an eye on this one. No precedent. We'll see if she can actually hold up under pressure." Another exchange with a department head included a chilling line. "Sometimes exposure is the best educator. If she's not ready, better now than later. Let's see how she responds to rigor." But the word rigor had been surrounded by quotation marks, as if mocking the very excuse being used to justify her singling out. It wasn't just about her performance. It was about setting an example. Her failure would serve as a warning to the next diversity pick, who dared to walk the halls without shame. The file also revealed that Harwood had authorized surveillance footage of Jania to be recorded during her lunch periods, under the label behavioral observation. The dates matched her first week. While she had been trying to blend in, eating alone under fluorescent lights, someone had been building a dossier. She wasn't a student to them. She was a subject under review, and now that the world was watching, Harwood needed to take control of the narrative again. 3 days after the video went viral, Roosevelt High called a sudden press conference. The school's main auditorium was cleaned, staged, and filled with carefully selected faculty members sitting as props behind the podium. The media had been invited with strict rules. No live streaming, no direct questions about personnel matters. But everyone knew why they were there. Harwood took the stage wearing a navy suit, his American flag lapel pin gleaming under the stage lights. His speech was calm, rehearsed and coded in administrative language designed to blur clarity. He referred to the video as a misunderstood moment of academic calibration. He spoke about ensuring all students feel safe and challenged, while never mentioning Jania's name. He denied any allegations of discrimination, claimed the test had been part of a pilot initiative to enhance curriculum tracking, and when asked directly by a reporter about the leaked emails, he smiled thinly and stated, "No such documentation exists. Any claim otherwise is fabricated." The moment was infuriating in its precision. Everything about the press conference was designed to cast doubt without denying outright. It was legalistic and cruel, a performance meant to distract, and for some it might have worked, if it weren't for the fact that just as Harwood walked off stage, someone from the back of the room handed a flash drive to a local journalist. Inside that flash drive were full-resolution email screenshots, unredacted, authenticated by a tech specialist. There were even internal chat logs, Slack messages from Roosevelt's administrative team, mocking the viral video. One message read, "Let them cry racism. This blowover by homecoming." Another joked, "Next time we'll use a lie detector." The journalists didn't wait. Within an hour they uploaded the files to a public archive, tweeting the link with the caption, "Here's what Roosevelt High didn't want you to see. Decide for yourself." It was the final crack in the dam. District officials were now under fire. Civil rights attorneys began calling for an investigation. A petition to remove Harwood gathered 100,000 signatures within 12 hours. Protesters began organizing outside the school gates. Not just parents and students but alumni who remembered how the school had buried similar stories for decades. It wasn't just a moment now, it was a movement. Inside the house, Rosa wept when she saw the emails. Not just out of anger, but because she realized how close they had come to letting it all slide. If the footage hadn't leaked, if the world hadn't cared, Jania would have been erased in silence, like so many others. But even in the whirlwind of noise and justice beginning to stir, something else happened. As Jania refreshed her screen, her inbox pinged with a new message from a blocked sender. The subject line read, "It's bigger than you think." Attached was a document titled, "Board Meeting, Closed Session Minutes Classified." Harwood holds a press conference denying everything, but someone's about to leak his emails. But now, someone just leaked the school board's private meeting notes. The morning after the school board's press conference, the Roosevelt campus no longer felt like a school. It felt like a crime scene waiting for the tape to go up. Staff walked the halls with downturned eyes, avoiding students who had begun filming everything, suspicious of every whisper. Even teachers who once ruled the classroom with arrogance now carried their lesson plans like shields. The silence wasn't peace, it was pressure. Everyone was waiting to see who would fall first, but Jania already knew who had cracked. The emails had done more than expose a mindset. They had revealed a strategy. The staff member who leaked them hadn't signed their name, but the formatting showed they had access to internal archives. These weren't screenshots or whispers. They were full documents, pulled from Roosevelt's staff servers, complete with metadata, timestamps and sender details. The headline of the most damning message was impossible to forget. This girl was admitted on a diversity quota. Let's be realistic. The email had been sent by Harwood himself, less than a month before school began. His words were casual, offhand, typed like a man so confident in his power he no longer bothered to hide his bias. The message wasn't sent to one person. It was forwarded to 3 department heads, and copied to 2 counselors. It was administrative venom, normalized by those who'd been sipping it for years. And it didn't stop there. Further down in the thread, a second message revealed Harwood's real intention. Let's track her academic response to pressure early. Failure may help tighten future enrollment control. Affirmative action creates liabilities we can't sustain. Jania read the words over and over again. Her fingers numb. Her mind stretched so thin it felt like it might crack. It was no longer a theory, or a quiet suspicion. This was proof. They hadn't simply doubted her. They planned for her to fail. Her existence wasn't seen as potential. It was viewed as a political risk. Her scholarship wasn't a celebration of merit. It was a loophole they wanted to close. And they had intended to use her as their example. News outlets that had once treaded cautiously around the issue now reported with fire. Civil rights organizations issued formal demands to the district. The American Education Justice League began circulating petitions and open letters to the school board. Parents who had once defended Roosevelt's traditional values found themselves having to explain how those values had turned into institutional humiliation of a black teenager who had done nothing but show up and try. Still, Harwood didn't resign. He doubled down. In a follow-up internal memo, leaked 2 days later, he described the outrage as media manipulation orchestrated by activist-aligned platforms. He claimed that administrative discretion was necessary to preserve academic integrity and warned of precedent-setting danger if Roosevelt's leadership was dictated by social media trends. His ego, untouched. His guilt, unacknowledged. The district scrambled. Board members publicly expressed concern while privately emailing their legal teams. Staff received memos warning them not to speak to press. And yet the story kept evolving. Every new leak brought more outrage. Every email showed just how comfortable these educators were weaponizing policy against the very students they were hired to protect. Jania, caught in the eye of the storm, spent those days in an emotional fog. Her name trended online alongside headlines, hashtags, and protest signs, but inside she felt the slow pull of numbness. Her mother's journal remained by her bed, a constant reminder that none of this was new. Every paragraph written in the 90s now played out again, only with sharper cameras and faster news cycles. She tried to hold on to the impact, the movement growing in her name, but her body remembered the library, the test, the isolation. It remembered what it felt like to be humiliated as a strategy. The breaking point came quietly. It was a Thursday evening when the package arrived. Brown, nondescript, hand-delivered, no postage, no tracking number. Her aunt found it on the porch, left beneath the welcome mat as if someone wanted it to be found but not noticed. Jania peeled the tape away with hesitant fingers. Inside was a manila envelope, and a small wrapped bundle tied in twine. The envelope contained printed sheets, more emails, but these were different. They weren't from Harwood. They were from Roosevelt's former assistant principal, a woman who had retired just last year, under quiet circumstances. The documents included years of notes, internal incident reports, and a list labeled "Flagged Students for Strategic Intervention." Jania scanned the list and recognized names. 2 of them were upperclassmen she had seen standing alone at lunch. One had been expelled during her sophomore year, reasons never explained. Another had left Roosevelt mid-semester after what the school called a disciplinary reassignment. Her name wasn't on the list yet, but there was a blank slot at the bottom, space left open for her. The bundle wrapped in twine was heavier. When she untied it, she found 3 flash drives and a small journal, not her mother's. This one was stamped with a Roosevelt staff ID number and the initials MG. Inside were handwritten notes from a teacher, likely the same one who had leaked the first emails, documenting every time Harwood had called a review meeting about students of color. They were called check-ins, academic evaluations, performance audits. But the notes were clear. These meetings never occurred for white students. And then, on the last flash drive, a video file. Jania opened it on her laptop, hand shaking. The screen lit up with grainy footage from a classroom security camera. The angle was from the back corner of a meeting room. Harwood stood at the whiteboard, flanked by 2 department chairs. He didn't know the camera was recording. His voice was clear. "We're not going to let the next generation of handouts redefine our standards," he said, tapping the board with a marker. "If this experiment doesn't work, we pull the rope tighter. Simple." The room didn't protest. One of the staff members even chuckled. It was all there. Not just racism, not just bias, but strategy, deliberate erasure. And this time, it was all on tape. Jania sat back in her chair, breath gone, the screen's cold light flickering across her face. It was more than proof. It was the final key. But before she could even close the file, another notification popped up on her screen. A new email from an anonymous sender. Subject line: "They're planning the next move. You're not safe at school tomorrow." Jania receives an anonymous package, and what's inside could flip the story upside down. And now she knows. They're not done with her yet. The envelope wasn't marked urgent. There were no fancy seals, no legal stamps, no signs that it contained anything of significance. But Jania froze the moment her aunt handed it to her. It was thick, heavy in a way that paper alone shouldn't have been. No return address, just her name written in neat cursive across the front. Something about the handwriting felt strangely familiar, though she couldn't place it at first. Her fingers trembled as she peeled back the flap, slowly pulling out the worn leather-bound journal, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, that carried the faint scent of lavender and dust. And then it hit her. She knew that scent. She'd smelled it on her mother's scarves, on the pillowcases she used to fold. She knew that handwriting. It was her mother's. Rosa hadn't mentioned sending anything. Confused, Ginnia glanced at the bottom of the package and found a folded note inside. The ink had faded slightly, but the signature at the bottom left no doubt. It was from her mother's older sister, Aunt Lorna, a woman Ginnia barely remembered but who had once lived just 2 towns over. The note was short, almost rushed, saying only that she'd seen the video, recognized the trap, and remembered something Ginnia's mother had tried to expose years ago. She hadn't wanted to get involved before, but watching her niece go through the same exact abuse, in the same exact district, changed everything. She found the journal while cleaning out boxes she had kept after the funeral, and something inside told her Ginnia needed it now. Ginnia sat on the edge of her bed and opened the first page. The handwriting was delicate, full of loops and curves, as if every word had been written with intention. The opening lines were dated April 1995. Her mother had been 16. At first, the entries were quiet observations about daily life, cafeteria noise, a teacher's offhand remark, the feeling of not being seen. But the tone shifted as the pages turned. The entries grew longer, darker, more urgent. Ginnia's mother had attended Lakemont High, a feeder school that was once considered Roosevelt's twin in status, now since restructured after an internal scandal that was never made public. She had been one of 3 black girls in her graduating class, and the only one in the school's AP Humanities track. There were constant comments about how well-spoken she was, how she carried herself so maturely. The language dripped with condescension, masked as praise. Her teachers praised her intelligence in private, but never called on her in class. Her college counselor urged her to aim realistically, despite her GPA. The journal entries didn't just describe microaggressions. They detailed systems, patterns. A gifted black student, intentionally tracked into mid-level courses. A younger boy suspended for wearing his natural hair too high. A teacher who insisted on grading tone in essays, and consistently rated black students as hostile. What stunned Ginnia most wasn't just the pain in her mother's words. It was how little had changed. The phrases, the codes, the tactics, the same language Harwood used, background, preparedness, standards, were the same phrases her mother had written about in anger. It wasn't coincidence. It was culture, a buried legacy passed from administrator to administrator. The most gut-wrenching entry came mid-journal. Her mother had written about preparing to file a formal complaint with the district after discovering that her test scores had been intentionally misreported on her college applications. She had spent weeks gathering evidence, even asking a secretary to help her make copies of the documents. But the day before she planned to submit it, she was called into the principal's office and accused of plagiarizing a scholarship essay. No evidence, no hearing, just an immediate in-school suspension and the threat of expulsion if she continued her campaign of disruption. The message was clear: stop fighting or disappear. Ginnia had never heard this story. Her mother had died before she was old enough to ask the kind of questions that opened old wounds. But the journal answered them in full, and it lit something inside her that no protest sign or trending hashtag ever could. Her fight wasn't new, it was inherited. This wasn't just about her test. It was about years of buried stories, erased resistance, and daughters forced to swallow the shame their mothers had never been allowed to name. Ginnia wasn't a spark. She was a continuation. She read for hours, tracing her fingers over every sentence like they were lifelines. She paused on one particular page where her mother had written a promise to her future child. She didn't know if she'd ever have one, didn't know what kind of world that child would inherit, but she prayed that if her child ever faced the same injustices, she would not face them alone, that she would have truth, that she would have this journal. The next morning, the house felt still, but Ginnia moved with quiet urgency. She placed the journal into her backpack like it was sacred. It wasn't just memory now. It was evidence, and she intended to use it. At school, the tension had only grown. Protesters still stood outside the gates. Teachers looked over their shoulders. Some students gave her high fives in secret. Others avoided eye contact. But everyone knew something big was coming. That afternoon her inbox pinged again. The subject line this time came from an official district account. The school board had called an emergency closed-door meeting to discuss recent developments and potential disruptions to Roosevelt's academic operations. The message didn't include a location. It didn't invite her. She wasn't mentioned at all. But Jania had already seen this scene play out before in ink. In her mother's handwriting. She knew what happened in those rooms. She knew who they protected. And this time she wouldn't let them do it in the dark. The school board schedules a closed-door meeting, and Jania is not invited. But she's not staying outside.
Not this time.
The next morning the sun rose slow and pale over Roosevelt High, casting long, sharp shadows across the campus, like the calm before a storm. But this was no ordinary day. Something about the air itself felt too quiet, too rehearsed. Students moved through the halls with tight shoulders, teachers shuffled with clipped voices, and no one mentioned the protests outside anymore, as if the silence would undo the scandal tightening around the school's throat. But deep within the administrative wing, behind locked doors and soundproof panels, a very different type of conversation was unfolding, and Genia Brooks was about to hear every word. The email warning her not to come to school hadn't come from a prank account. It hadn't been hysterical or anonymous in tone. It had been measured, direct, and inside the subject line was a single phrase, Board Session 3B. Location changed. That single detail confirmed what she already suspected. There was going to be a closed-door meeting today, and whatever was discussed inside, it wouldn't be shared with the public, or with her. But Janaea had no plans to stay home. Not after the emails. Not after the flash drive. Not after she'd heard Harwood refer to her life as an experiment. This wasn't about self-preservation anymore. It was about exposure. If they were planning their next move in secret, then she had to see it before it was weaponized against her again. It took just one favor from someone no one ever noticed. Mr. Keene, the aging janitor with faded tattoos and a limp from an old construction injury. He had been working at Roosevelt long enough to remember past scandals, past silences, past students who disappeared from the honor roll without explanation. And he remembered Jania's mother, not just her name, but her fire. That mattered. When Jania approached him with nothing more than a look and a whispered question, he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for details. He simply nodded once and said, "Meet me by the south stairwell." 15 minutes before the second bell. True to his word, he guided her down a back hallway students never used, past a locked faculty lounge, through an access tunnel lined with decades-old plumbing, and finally to the maintenance corridor that wrapped behind the administration offices. The air smelled like bleach and wax. The tiles were cracked. No cameras down here, just forgotten storage closets and ventilation ducts. He stopped beside a metal cabinet and slid it aside, revealing a small space barely large enough for a body to crouch behind. From here, the thin wall separated her from the boardroom. The ventilation grate above offered clear audio. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe. But it was access. She slipped inside and waited. Through the vent she could hear chairs scraping, papers shuffling, voices clearing. And then the meeting began. At first the board's tone was procedural, policy language, attendance confirmations, legal terminology. But within minutes the mask slipped. A woman, likely the superintendent, brought up the public's overreaction to the leaked media and suggested that narrative redirection was necessary to preserve the school's image. Another voice, male, older, argued that the situation had spiraled due to internal disloyalty and insisted that identifying the whistleblower should be their top priority. But the words that made Jania's spine stiffen came next. "Her story's out there now," one board member said. "We need to frame it as a misunderstanding. That test, we spin it as a district-wide pilot that just happened to begin with her. Standard policy." Another agreed.
Yes.
Normalize it. If we admit it was targeted, we open the floodgates for lawsuits.
Jania's heartbeat thundered in her ears. This wasn't just about covering tracks. They were rewriting reality, turning deliberate cruelty into bureaucratic procedure. And then came the worst blow. "We may need to consider disciplinary action for the student," someone else said. "She accessed restricted material. She's inciting unrest. There's precedent for expulsion due to disruptive conduct, regardless of scholarship status." There was a pause. No one objected. No one said her name. But they all knew exactly who they were talking about. Beneath the cabinet, Jania's breath hitched. Her throat burned with anger. But she kept still, her phone pressed tightly against the grate, recording every vile sentence, every strategy to erase her. She knew this tape, more than the emails, more than the footage, could change everything. It wasn't just about racism anymore. It was about abuse of power. But as the conversation escalated, so did the tension in her muscles. Her knees were beginning to ache. Her legs had gone numb. And in the cramped space, her foot nudged something she hadn't seen before. A plastic mop bucket, half filled with sloshed water. It had been tucked behind her in the dark, forgotten. She tried not to move, tried to breathe shallow and steady. But her foot slipped again, just slightly, and the bucket tipped. The sound of water hitting tile echoed louder than a gunshot. Inside the boardroom, the voices stopped. Chairs scraped. Someone stood. "Did you hear that?" Jania froze. Her breath stopped completely. The silence on the other side turned electric, heavy with suspicion. A male voice said, "Check the maintenance corridor." Panic surged through her like fire. She shoved her phone into her hoodie pocket, her back slick with sweat. Footsteps were already moving, fast and heavy toward the hallway. She pushed herself out from behind the cabinet, but the corridor was too narrow, and she could hear someone rattling the door on the far end. Her only exit was the way she came in, and it was too far. Then, from the shadows, a hand reached out and grabbed her arm.
Mr. Keene.
Without a word, he yanked her into an adjacent supply closet, shutting the door with a slow, silent click. Through the crack, they both watched as two security officers stormed down the hallway, flashlights in hand. They didn't see her. Not yet. But someone had heard her, and now the board knew someone had been listening. She accidentally knocks over a mop bucket. The room goes silent. Now the hunt begins. And the proof is still on her phone. The news broke quietly, buried under the day's chaos like a headline someone wanted forgotten. But it spread through Roosevelt's halls, with the force of a gut punch. Miss Anna Garland, longtime literature teacher, and one of the few staff members who had never treated Jania with condescension, had been suspended without pay. The reason given was unprofessional conduct and violation of internal confidentiality protocol. But the truth, known to those who paid attention, ran deeper. Garland had been the only one inside Roosevelt, willing to put herself at risk by leaking the first batch of emails, the ones that confirmed Jania wasn't a mistake, but a target, and now she was being made an example. There was no announcement, just an empty classroom. Her name scraped off the faculty board, her email account deactivated. A letter sent to parents reminding them of the school's commitment to ethical boundaries and respect for institutional privacy. The phrasing was vague, the timing deliberate. Harwood's administration couldn't stop the story, but they could punish those who tried to tell it. Jania didn't wait for permission. That evening, as the sun melted behind a line of distant rooftops, she caught a ride with Rosa to the east end of town, where Garland lived in a weathered duplex surrounded by quiet trees and a cracked driveway. There were no protest signs here, no noise, no reporters, just silence, and the weight of what it meant to lose everything for telling the truth. Garland looked thinner than usual, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She opened the door wearing a faded college hoodie and motioned Jania inside without a word. The living room was small, the furniture worn but clean. Books lined the walls in chaotic stacks, interrupted only by a dusty diploma and a photo of a much younger Garland standing with a group of smiling black students, all former scholarship winners. The contrast between that photo and the current moment was stark. That teacher had hope in her eyes. The woman in front of Jania now looked like someone who had spent her career watching truth get buried, and still chose to unearth it one more time. They didn't speak for a while. Garland brewed tea and handed Jania a cup, her hands trembling slightly. She sat across from her, the steam rising between them like smoke over the ruins of a battle they'd both been dragged into. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, measured, not broken, but close. She told Jania she had known what would happen, that once she forwarded those emails to the reporter, she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But what else was she supposed to do? Watch another student get dismantled while administrators called it policy? Let the board weaponize silence again? She said she didn't regret it. Not for a second. But she was scared, because the district had already sent her a legal notice, one step away from a defamation lawsuit. Her union rep advised her to back down, apologize, and retire early. But Garland wasn't built for retreat. Instead, she gestured toward a locked file cabinet in the corner of the room. It looked ordinary, beige metal, scratched surface, but the weight of Garland's gaze made it feel sacred. She stood slowly, walked over, and pulled out a folder thick enough to split at the seams. She placed it on the coffee table between them, with the care of someone laying down a body. This wasn't about Jania's test anymore. Inside that folder was nearly a decade of internal memos, parent complaints, student testimonies, gradebook discrepancies, and handwritten notes. Patterns of sudden academic drops for Black students in their junior year. Teachers being encouraged to lower subjective marks, like participation and attitude scores. Emails where Harwood referred to the optics of aggressive expressions as a red flag, even when students hadn't broken any rules. It wasn't just racial bias, it was racial management. Systematic, quiet, calculated. Jania flipped through the papers with wide eyes, her heart pounding harder the deeper she read. These were receipts, detailed, time-stamped, undeniable. Garland had tracked it all. But then she paused. Her hand froze over a yellowed envelope tucked between two reports from on the front. A single name had been written in faded ink. Tasha Freeman, her mother. Jania swallowed hard and opened it slowly. Inside were printed emails, guidance notes, and a disciplinary slip. Her mother's. One page stood out immediately. A complaint form filed by Tasha at the age of 16, accusing Roosevelt's sister school of forging her report card transcript. The form had been submitted, then marked retracted in red ink, though there was no retraction letter attached. Below it, an unsigned note read, "Student misunderstood academic placement recommendations. No further action needed." Garland leaned forward, her voice low. She said she'd found that envelope in the district's old archive storage during her summer volunteering stint, a few years ago. She hadn't known Jania back then, hadn't made the connection, but when the story went public, and she saw the same last name, she dug it out. Jania sat back, the journal now echoing louder in her memory. The patterns were no longer abstract. Her mother hadn't just experienced what she had. She had tried to fight it, and had been shut down, covered up, silenced. That retracted complaint had cost her a scholarship. And now history had wrapped itself around her daughter like a noose lined in paper. Garland's hands were folded tightly in her lap now. She told Jania that if this folder went public, the district would retaliate harder. They'd sue her for breach of confidential records, possibly revoke her pension. They would smear her name in every publication. But she was willing. The only thing she needed was for Jania to decide how it would be used. Garland couldn't be the voice anymore, but Jania could be. The folder felt like a weapon in her hands. Heavy, uncomfortable, necessary. She was about to thank her when something slid out from the back of the folder. A small, folded note. It was old, nearly torn in half, written in rushed handwriting. It was addressed from her mother, to Garland. "If they ever come for my daughter like they came for me, don't stay quiet." Jania's throat clenched. Her vision blurred. Her mother had seen all of this coming. She had known the machine wouldn't change, but she had trusted someone would still be there when the cycle returned. Jania closed the folder carefully. Outside, a car engine idled too long. Headlights paused on the front porch. Garland went still. There was no knock, no footsteps, just the lingering glow of high beams through the curtains, and the unmistakable sense of being watched. Jania opens the file, and sees her mother's name inside. But now someone knows she has it.
And they may already be outside. The high beams disappeared as suddenly as they came, but their lingering presence cast a shadow over every word in the file now resting on Garland's coffee table. Jania sat still, her breath barely audible, the weight of her mother's name stitched into every paragraph of that folder. She hadn't come here expecting her life to shift this drastically in one night. But now, with the pages of her mother's buried truth spread out before her, something irreversible had settled into her chest. A bitter clarity. Her mother, Tasha Freeman, hadn't just experienced racism. She hadn't just endured it quietly. She had tried to fight, and she had paid the price. That envelope bearing her name wasn't a loose document, lost in storage. It was a silenced testimony. A civil rights complaint that never saw daylight, buried by the same hands, now trying to bury Jania's story with bureaucratic phrases and legal threats. The complaint was detailed, handwritten, passionate but measured, factual yet emotional. It described retaliation from teachers, grade tampering, psychological isolation. Tasha had listed 3 specific staff members, the same ones now serving on Roosevelt's current advisory board. The language of her accusations echoed the same phrases Jania had seen in her own disciplinary warnings: disruptive presence, tone concern, academic potential under review. Her mother had described them 30 years earlier, word for word, like they had copied and pasted the script for controlling students like them, generation after generation. At the bottom of the complaint, there was a red stamp, case closed, due to withdrawal.
Except Tasha had never withdrawn. The file included a suspension notice, and weeks later, an expulsion letter signed off by the same administrator who now sat beside Harwood during board meetings. They hadn't just erased her complaint, they'd erased her. Jania stared at the name, stunned. Her fingers tightened on the paper like she was holding on to something far more fragile than ink. Her mother had never told her any of this, not because she was hiding it, but because the pain of being silenced had left no space for retelling. That silence, passed down, had nearly kept Jania from fighting back herself. And now, staring at the evidence, it hit her like a slow wave of fire. Roosevelt's history wasn't broken. It was built this way. Deliberate, refined, perfected. Garland sat across from her quietly, the lines on her face etched deep with years of watching the system maintain its order by simply waiting students like Jania out. The folder on the table was thick, but Garland assured her it wasn't even the full archive. She had pulled what she could, scanned it, copied it, but there were boxes in the district storage she hadn't been able to access. The real evidence, decades of suppressed complaints, rewritten files, rigged assessments, was locked away. But this folder was enough to start a war, and Jania was no longer afraid of one. That night, she didn't sleep. She reread her mother's letter from the journal, and stared at the expulsion notice until she memorized every name. Her mother hadn't just been pushed out, she'd been marked, denied a future. And still she had raised a daughter who believed in building one. By morning, Jania's decision was made. This wasn't about defending herself anymore. She wouldn't survive in silence. She would speak, loudly, permanently. She spent the day gathering everything. The folder from Garland, the flash drives, the journal, the footage from the secret board meeting, the emails. She uploaded it all to a cloud drive, created multiple backups, sent copies to trusted allies, student journalists, legal aides, activists. She didn't need permission to go public. She needed the right moment. It arrived faster than she expected. A national news network, QTN America, known for hard-hitting exposés on systemic injustice, reached out to her via encrypted message. One of their senior producers had followed the story from the first video leak. They'd seen the email, and now they were offering her a full-hour exclusive interview. No edits, no scripts, just her story, uncensored. Broadcast nationwide. Jania didn't flinch. She said yes. Rosa, though anxious, stood behind her. Garland, quietly reinstated by legal pressure from the teachers' union, sent her a message of support. Students at Roosevelt organized a digital walkout, a massive virtual gathering to watch the interview as it aired. The community was ready, the country was listening, and for the first time, the power shifted. But Harwood wasn't finished. He had seen the same headlines, heard the same rumblings, and when the news of Jania's exclusive interview hit the district office, he made his move. The school's internal portal, a system used to store teacher notes, disciplinary actions, and behavior logs, was updated just hours before the interview was set to be recorded. A new note had been added to Jania's student file: violation of academic integrity, incident pending review. It claimed she had accessed restricted faculty files without permission, that she had stolen and distributed private instructional material, that her test footage had been edited before being leaked, that she had coordinated a smear campaign against the school through undisclosed adult intermediaries. A formal investigation was now underway. Harwood wasn't attacking the facts. He was attacking her credibility. The timing was no coincidence. He wanted to cast doubt on her name, just before the country heard her voice. When Jania logged into her student account to upload a scholarship essay that afternoon, a red banner flashed at the top of the screen: status under review, administrative hearing scheduled. She stared at the notice for a long time, and then without hesitation she opened her inbox and confirmed the interview with QTN. If Harwood thought his scare tactics would push her back into silence, he hadn't read her mother's journal. He hadn't heard her voice shake the corners of that private boardroom. He hadn't watched her refuse to break when they built a test to break her. Jania was no longer just resisting. She was ready to burn the entire blueprint down. A major news network contacts Jania for an exclusive interview. But Harwood makes a countermove. And now he's accusing her of academic fraud, the same lie they used to destroy her mother. The day of the interview arrived, with a tension that felt heavier than anything Jania had carried before. It showed in the stiffness of Rosa's movements, in the silence that hung between them at breakfast, in the soft creak of the house as though even the walls understood the stakes. The entire country was preparing to hear her voice. Unfiltered, unedited, A voice that had been silenced too many times in too many rooms. But while supporters celebrated her courage online, Harwood was orchestrating a plan behind closed doors, one born of desperation and ego, a last attempt to reassert control before the truth swallowed him whole. The notification came just after noon. A confidential email from Roosevelt's administrative portal, flagged with urgency and marked as a disciplinary update. The moment Jania opened it, she felt the familiar sting of institutional betrayal. Harwood had filed new claims against her, not as accusations whispered in meeting rooms, but as official records added to her permanent file. They painted her as a manipulator, a disruptor, someone who weaponized public attention to orchestrate chaos. The phrasing was careful but cruel. Incidents of plagiarism noted, but never reported. Allegations of classroom aggression reinterpreted from moments where she'd simply asked questions. Hints that she had been argumentative with staff long before the viral video surfaced. It was an attempt to rewrite her entire academic history. Even worse, the email stated that if the allegations became public record, which Harwood strongly implied they would, her scholarship status would be reconsidered by all affiliated institutions. Her acceptance to future universities could be jeopardized. Her transcript could be flagged, and for a girl who had fought for every opportunity carved out of a world designed to deny her, the threat was not just intimidation, it was erasure. Jania's hands shook as she scrolled through each line. She saw the same words used against her mother decades ago. Disruptive, uncooperative, academically questionable, terms that always hovered close to students like them. Pulled out whenever someone needed justification for punishment. It wasn't only history repeating, it was the same playbook, the same signatures, the same strategy. Rosa saw the fear tightening around her, and stepped closer, but even her presence couldn't soften the blow. The interview, once an opportunity to expose the truth, now felt like a trap waiting to snap shut. Would the public believe her once Harwood released doctored records? Would the interview be dismissed as the emotional response of a student caught in misconduct? Would she become another footnote in Roosevelt's long list of silenced voices? Her mother's story repeating itself in modern ink. Rumors online had already begun to change. Anonymous accounts questioned her intentions. Comment threads demanded to see the full story. It didn't matter that the allegations were fabricated. Doubt was a powerful poison, and Harwood was counting on it. The weight of it all pressed into her ribs, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She imagined the interview airing, her face filling the screen, her voice trembling as she recounted the truth, only for viewers to scroll hours later through headlines announcing her suspension for misconduct. She imagined news anchors speculating, commentators dissecting her credibility, universities backing away, activists turning their attention to the next case, leaving her behind as collateral damage. Her aunt saw the way her shoulders curled inward, and sat beside her, offering the kind of silence that had comfort woven into it. Rosa knew this wasn't just a public battle, it was personal. Harwood wasn't trying to protect the school anymore. He was trying to destroy a child who dared to survive him. The phone rang twice that afternoon. First from the network confirming the final details of the interview, then from a private number that made Rosa hesitate before answering. The conversation was brief, but the tension in her posture said enough. She hung up and turned to Jania with fear shading her expression. The district had contacted her directly, warning that participating in the interview could lead to unforeseen consequences, not just for Jania but for their entire household. The phrasing was vague, but the intent was unmistakable. The administration was not merely trying to silence a student, they were trying to intimidate her family. For a moment Rosa considered pulling the plug entirely. As much as she supported her niece, she feared that the interview might be the match that burned every bridge Jania still had. Maybe it was wiser to stay quiet. Maybe defending herself publicly would only give Harwood more ammunition. Maybe survival meant retreat. But Jania had lived her entire life watching her mother's dreams shrink under the weight of silence. She had read pages of a journal filled with unspoken pain. She had witnessed the manipulation that kept her mother from justice, and nearly kept her from knowing the truth. She refused to be the next generation that swallowed injustice because the alternative was too dangerous. The hours leading up to the interview felt surreal. Outside, cars passed without knowing the world inside the house was on the brink of something irreversible. Inside, the tension settled into Jania like a second heartbeat. Steady, relentless. She looked at her mother's journal laid open on the desk. The pages no longer felt like history. They felt like prophecy. As she prepared for the interview, her mind sharpened. The fear did not leave her, but it began to make space for something else. Clarity. Harwood wasn't acting out of strength. His desperation revealed his weakness. He only struck this hard because he knew her truth could break him. Every fabricated accusation, every twisted record, every threat only proved how deeply he feared the world hearing her side. The interview team arrived just before dusk. They set up lights in the living room, cleared empty mugs from the coffee table, and tested the microphones. As they worked, Jania stood at the doorway, feeling the weight of the world balancing on the next hour of her life. She thought about backing out. She thought about hiding. But each time hesitation rose, her mother's handwriting answered it. The producer counted down silently from 5. The camera's red light blinked on. In that moment, there was no turning back. The world leaned in. Millions waited. Jania healed slowly, grounding herself. The truth, once buried, stepped into the light, and then the broadcast went live. The interview airs anyway, and millions watch live. Now the question is not whether her story will be heard, but what will be unleashed because of it. The screen faded from black, and in millions of living rooms, phones, offices, classrooms, and newsrooms across the country, Jania Brooks's face appeared. There were no flashy graphics, no dramatic music, just her, sitting calmly in front of a bookshelf, framed by the soft golden light spilling through her aunt's curtains. The camera held on her long enough for silence to build tension. And when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It was deliberate, steady, and unforgettable. She began with her name. Then the school. Then the moment everything shifted. From there she unfolded the story piece by piece. Not as a victim desperate for sympathy, but as a witness, a daughter and a survivor, holding up a mirror to the country that had allowed this system to thrive. She didn't dramatize. She didn't rant. She simply told the truth with such precision that each word felt like it had been waiting years to be spoken. When she held up the test packet Harwood had given her, the one full of college-level questions disguised as a freshman assessment, viewers leaned in closer. When she described the moment, she realized the recording wasn't about progress but proof of failure. Something deeper cracked open in the audience. And when she played the grainy audio from the secret boardroom meeting, where Harwood and others debated spinning her targeting as standard policy, the shift was seismic. But it wasn't until she opened her mother's journal, the leather-bound relic that had survived 2 decades of dust and silence, that the air inside that broadcast changed completely. Jania read aloud from the pages, her voice trembling for the first time. She shared her mother's dreams, her fears, her disappointment. She spoke of the complaint her mother had filed, and the silence that followed. She explained how her mother was expelled, not for her behavior but for refusing to be compliant. And then, she held up the expulsion letter, the matching administrator's signature, and the side-by-side comparison of her own threat notice. The timeline spoke louder than she ever could. Her life wasn't a tragic anomaly. It was a template. Somewhere in the middle of the interview, the producer turned off his earpiece. The control room had gone quiet. No one dared interrupt what was happening. Viewers texted each other without looking away. College students in dorms opened group chats in disbelief. Parents called out to their children to come watch. In a country oversaturated with content, Jania's truth cut through every noise barrier. Social media ignited in real time. Leather Learn resurfaced and began trending again. But now, it was joined by new ones. Justice for Jania, Shut Down Roosevelt, and Not Again. Celebrities posted clips of her reading from her mother's journal, some in stunned silence, others with messages demanding accountability. Educators across the nation began sharing their own hidden stories of internal bias, surveillance, and the silent erasure of potential. Civil rights attorneys, education advocates, and public defenders began organizing. Not tomorrow, not next week, that night. Outside Roosevelt High, the protest that had once been a small group of students and local activists swelled into a crowd so large it spilled into the streets. Candles were lit. Posters rose into the sky. The gates of the school, once a symbol of prestige, now stood like a fortress under siege. Reporters lined the sidewalks, helicopters hovered overhead, and still Jania kept speaking. As the final minutes of the interview approached, the anchor asked if there was anything else she wanted the world to know. Jania didn't hesitate. She explained that what happened to her was not isolated, but systemic. She spoke of black students being pushed into remedial tracks despite their grades, of attitude being coded language for non-compliance, of how schools used surveillance, not support, to monitor those they didn't trust. She named the administrators who had signed off on her mother's expulsion, and her own pending disciplinary review. She ended with a line pulled straight from her mother's journal. If they try to silence your child like they silenced you, don't whisper, roar. The screen faded out, and America roared. Within an hour, Roosevelt's website crashed from the surge in traffic. The district's phone lines were jammed. Major news networks re-aired the interview in full. Politicians made statements. State education boards launched immediate review. By midnight, an emergency meeting was held behind closed doors, and before sunrise, it was announced that Principal Richard Harwood had been placed on indefinite leave pending investigation. It was a seismic fall. A man who had spent years crafting an image of discipline and prestige, undone by a student's voice and her mother's buried truth. But for Jania, the victory didn't taste like celebration. It tasted like grief, because it shouldn't have taken this much to be believed. The morning after the interview aired, Roosevelt High remained eerily quiet. Students who once avoided eye contact with Jania now looked at her with stunned admiration. Teachers kept their doors open. Some offered nods of quiet solidarity. The administrative wing remained locked. Harwood's office dark, his nameplate gone. But just as the weight of the moment began to settle, something unexpected happened. A senior student, someone Jania had barely spoken to, approached her near the school gates. His eyes were wide, haunted. In his hands he held a folder, not one stolen, not one mailed, but one handed to him months earlier by a teacher who had since resigned. The student explained that he hadn't understood what it meant at the time. He had thought it was some bureaucratic mess, nothing important. But after watching the interview, he went back to look. Inside were grading rubrics, internal class reports, and a flagged evaluation sheet, not of Jania, but of another student. A boy named Darren Walker, who had once led Roosevelt's debate team, but vanished from the school's records midway through his junior year. The report labeled Darren as non-compliant, socially disruptive, and questionable academic integrity. He hadn't just disappeared, he had been erased, and this file might hold the key to proving it. Harwood is placed on leave, but a student reveals a bombshell. Roosevelt's ghosts are returning, and Jania may not be the only one they tried to silence. The folder the senior handed to Jania didn't look like much at first. It was worn around the edges, the manila cover slightly curled from being shoved into the bottom of a backpack for too long. But the weight of it, emotional, not physical, settled in her arms the moment she took it. Something about the student's expression, the urgency in his eyes, told her this wasn't just a document. It was a missing piece. Another buried truth. Roosevelt had quietly tucked away, and now it was time to open it. Inside, page after page, revealed a grading system unlike anything she had ever seen in an official school record. It wasn't just numbers and averages. It was coded language, veiled in academic jargon but soaked in bias. At the top of each rubric was a title: Presentation Performance Index, PPI. The categories underneath appeared normal at a glance: articulation, professionalism, tone control, cultural fluency, standard speech alignment. But the further she read, the more disturbing the patterns became. Each category was scored on a 10-point scale, but the notes in the margins told a darker story. Non-standard dialect, detected. Doc 3 Ps. Informal tone, lacks polish. Slouching posture, weak eye contact, suggest retraining. These weren't academic critiques. They were personality assessments, framed as performance flaws. And almost every time a black student's name appeared next to the comments, the deductions multiplied. Names like Darren Walker, like Michaela Hart, names of students who had mysteriously transferred or fallen off track just before senior year. It became clear that Harwood hadn't just created an impossible academic test for Jania. He had engineered an entire system where subjective interpretation became law, where whiteness was the template, and any deviation from it was marked as deficiency. Presentation etiquette was praised only when it mirrored a narrow standard. Speaking with measured Midwestern intonation, avoiding emotional speech, keeping gestures minimal. Even hair was mentioned in the behavioral notes. One student was docked points for distracting style, recommend neutral grooming. Another was cited for overexpressive hand movement, reframed tone for audience. It was a weaponized matrix, designed not to educate but to assimilate. Jania sat with it for hours, combing through each line until the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't about grades, it was about control. About shaping students into something palatable, or punishing them for being authentic. Her test, her surveillance, her evaluation, they were all just extensions of this hidden framework. She hadn't been targeted randomly. She was flagged because she didn't fit into a system that had already decided what excellence looked like. And it did not look like her. She called Garland immediately. The teacher's voice trembled when she heard about the folder. Not because she was surprised, but because she had suspected for years that such a document existed. Garland explained that teachers were never shown the full breakdown. They were given final scores to input, but the PPI evaluations were handled by a small administrative subcommittee, overseen by Harwood himself. It had been pitched as a pilot to measure academic readiness among incoming scholarship students, but it had never been reviewed, never approved by the state board, and never disclosed to parents. The revelation sparked a chain reaction. Jania scanned the entire document and sent it to the legal team that had contacted her after the interview. Within hours, the information was verified and shared with education watchdogs. That evening, a prominent civil rights lawyer published an open statement calling the PPI system a modern segregation tool masquerading as scholastic structure. Activists reposted the rubrics with highlighted annotations, showing side-by-side comparisons of students with identical academic records but vastly different PPI scores, almost always correlating with race, class, or speech pattern. News outlets picked it up fast. Articles ran with titles like, "The Grading System That Punishes Black Students for Existing," and "How Roosevelt High Created a Classroom Caste System." Commentators on nightly news shows debated the ethics of behavior-based scoring. Former Roosevelt alumni came forward in droves, some with their own hidden files, others simply echoing stories of being told they were too passionate, too intense, or not a good fit. The nation had heard about Jania's test, but this was the architecture behind it all. And then came the moment no one expected. The State Education Board of California issued a public notice. A formal investigation had been launched into Roosevelt High's administrative practices. The language was sharp and decisive. The board would subpoena all internal documents, grading policies, behavioral tracking systems, and staff correspondence from the past 10 years. A full audit. No room for cover-ups. No time to shred files. Roosevelt's gates, once symbols of prestige, now looked like walls surrounding a crumbling fortress. Inside the school, panic spread among the upper faculty. Department heads were seen pulling flash drives from desktops. Office doors stayed closed longer. Teachers whispered nervously in break rooms, unsure who would be questioned next. Harwood was still on leave, unreachable, but his shadow loomed large in the locked drawers, in the sealed storage units, in the policies no one dared defend out loud. And yet, amid the chaos, something shifted. Students began holding lunchtime teach-ins. They analyzed the rubrics, dissected the bias, wrote their own versions of what a fair system could look like. Parents showed up to PTA meetings with folders in hand. They demanded transparency, equity, and accountability. The school was no longer just a battleground. It had become a classroom for justice. Still, Jania couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The folder had been hidden for a reason. Someone had slipped it to that senior before graduating, knowing they wouldn't be around to see what came next. But why only that file? Why only the PPI rubric? And not more? Her questions were answered in the most unexpected way. Late one evening, just as she was finishing another round of interviews with investigative journalists, she received an encrypted email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was simple: "You've only scratched the surface." Attached was a zip file. Inside, a map of the school's network servers.
Every hidden folder.
Every password-protected database. Every digital footprint Harwood and his team thought they had concealed. The State Education Board launches an investigation and subpoenas every record from Roosevelt. But now Jania holds the keys to the digital vault, and what she finds next may be even darker than anyone imagined. The state hearing wasn't held in a courtroom or a school auditorium. It took place in a sterile, windowless government building in Sacramento, where every sound echoed too loud and every fluorescent light made skin look pale and tired. But for Jania Brooks, the room might as well have been carved from marble. It was the place where her voice, after months of being surveilled, silenced, edited, and doubted, would be entered into the official record, under oath in front of the same system that once allowed her pain to be protocol. She sat at a long mahogany table, hands folded over a printed copy of her testimony. Her shoulders straightened, not out of confidence but necessity. Her fingers trembled faintly, not from fear but from the weight of knowing what this moment represented. Behind her, civil rights attorneys, education reform advocates, and former students filled the gallery. Some carried folders, some carried memories, All carried expectation. The panel of state education officials sat across from her, their expressions flat, their voices clipped as they went through formalities. She had been sworn in minutes earlier, her name entered into the record with the same sterile cadence used for budget reports. But Jania had no illusions. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a turning point, and she was the one guiding it. When she finally spoke, the room stilled. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't raise it, didn't beg for attention, didn't search for pity. She spoke with the calm of someone who had rehearsed her pain enough times that the delivery no longer cracked, but still carried its full weight. She began with the test. The moment she was summoned from lunch, handed a packet filled with material no freshman could solve, filmed like a suspect, then discarded. She explained how the footage had been weaponized to humiliate her, then backfired when the internet saw it for what it was, a setup masked as assessment. She moved through the timeline with exactness. The leaked emails, Harwood's calculated language about diversity quotas, the phrase "let's be realistic," the plan to track her failure before she had even taken her first quiz. She described the moment she found her mother's journal, the shock of seeing identical language from 30 years earlier, the realization that her test wasn't personal, it was policy passed down. Every time she paused, the silence hung longer. Then she spoke about the grading matrix, the performance index, the penalization of students for non-standard dialect, tone control, and emotional presentation. She explained how Black students had been marked down for existing outside a fabricated academic template, how these hidden scores had derailed college applications, how students had disappeared, names erased not for cheating or fighting, but for failing to conform to whiteness in disguise. And then she placed her mother's expulsion letter on the table. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She let the document speak with her. Tasha Freeman, expelled for academic dishonesty after filing a complaint, never reinstated, never acknowledged. The signature on that letter matched the current chair of Roosevelt's admissions committee. The silence in the room turned from attention to discomfort. One of the panelists shifted. Another cleared their throat, but none interrupted her. Because by then, Jenia wasn't just recounting a series of events. She was carving her mother's name into the public record, where no administrator could bury it again. She ended her testimony not with a plea but with a challenge. She asked what would happen to the students who had already been erased. What would be done for those who never had cameras filming their humiliation, or social media to defend them? What reparations looked like in classrooms where trust had been shattered by surveillance disguised as support. She asked if the state board had the courage to do more than issue a press release. Then she sat back and folded her hands. The applause wasn't allowed, but it came anyway. Quiet at first, then growing. The gallery stood with her, silently at first, then with nods, then with tears. A former Roosevelt student, who had transferred after sophomore year, wiped his eyes. A retired teacher held her chest. The air inside that sterile room changed. And it didn't leave. Within the hour, the board announced preliminary sanctions, an immediate halt to Roosevelt's grading policies, a freeze on administrative evaluations, and a full review of past disciplinary actions from the last 10 years. A special oversight committee would be formed. Students wrongly disciplined under the performance matrix would be contacted for record correction. The phrase "permanent sanction" echoed through the press room like thunder. But as Jania prepared to leave, still processing the seismic shift she had just triggered, the room shifted again. A man in a tailored navy suit entered the chamber without announcement. His walk was slower than before, his hair grayer, his eyes harder. But there was no mistaking him. Richard Harwood, escorted by a woman with a leather briefcase and a cold expression. He stood before the board, ignored the gallery, and handed over a sealed envelope. It was a formal lawsuit, Harwood v. Brooks, claiming defamation, malicious misrepresentation, career destruction. He was suing Jania personally. Gasps filled the room. The board froze, but Harwood didn't look for approval. He turned toward Jania as if daring her to respond, his ego bruised but his bitterness still intact. The message was clear: if he couldn't silence her through suspension, if he couldn't stop her with bureaucracy, he would try to bury her in court. Harwood, disgraced and bitter, walks into the hearing with a new lawyer and files a defamation lawsuit against Jania. Now the fight isn't just about the system, it's about survival. In front of a jury, the courthouse stood like a monument carved from stone, gray and towering against a sky that had forgotten how to be anything but overcast. The streets outside were lined with news vans, protesters and supporters waving signs that bore Jania's face next to words like "truth isn't defamation" and let her speak. What had started as a local scandal had evolved into a national reckoning. And now, with cameras stationed at every corner, the case of Harwood v. Brooks had become the trial the country couldn't look away from. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a quiet tension that stretched tight across every wooden bench. Civil rights lawyers sat beside teachers, students, and journalists. Legal analysts whispered predictions while courtroom sketch artists hunched over their pads, trying to capture the expressions that would define this chapter of history. But all eyes eventually returned to the two central figures. Jania, poised and composed despite the storm swirling around her, and Harwood, older now, stripped of the prestige that once made him untouchable, sitting behind a table with a legal team more expensive than ethical. Harwood's lawyers began with a performance. They framed him as the misunderstood authority figure, a man committed to academic excellence, now vilified by a student who, in their words, harnessed the chaos of social media to destroy a career. They painted Jania as strategic, manipulative, even coached. They emphasized her interviews, her rising public profile, her growing support online. They showed screenshots of edited posts, memes, exaggerated tweets, all meant to blur the line between truth and spectacle. But Jania's legal team was prepared. They didn't respond with emotion. They responded with evidence. The attorney representing her began with the original leaked emails, Harwood's words, unaltered, showing intent. Then came the test packet, the assessment designed not to evaluate, but to expose and humiliate. They walked the jury through the video clip, frame by frame, until no one in the courtroom could deny what it truly showed. Not a fair academic process, but a calculated attempt to dismantle a child's future. Then came the documents from Garland's archive. The whistleblower's file revealed a pattern stretching back nearly a decade. Students flagged for minor behavior issues, grades shifted without teacher consent, recommendations withheld, and at the center of nearly every case, Harwood. But the turning point arrived, with the full exposure of the grading matrix, the PPI rubric. The defense placed copies on each juror's bench. They read aloud the categories: standard speech alignment, cultural fluency, presentation discipline. They showed the handwritten comments that penalized natural hair, regional accents, and passionate tones. The defense called it what it was: a system that penalized identity and rewarded performance of whiteness. Jania sat through it all, with a quiet, unwavering focus. She didn't break. She didn't flinch. When she finally took the stand, her testimony didn't mirror the interviews that had gone viral. It was sharper now, stripped of camera-friendly phrasing. She spoke plainly, recounting each moment in detail: the cold chair in the library, the heat behind her eyes when she realized the test was never meant to be passed, the way Harwood looked at her as if her failure would be a confirmation. The jury leaned forward. She didn't use her mother's journal this time. She didn't have to. She was the journal now, a living record of everything the institution tried to erase. Harwood's attorneys attempted to cross-examine with aggression, but it backfired. Every question meant to make her seem performative, only made them look desperate. When they accused her of exaggeration, her attorneys submitted timestamps from the board meeting, recording. When they implied she had violated school policy by exposing internal documents, the judge reminded them that whistleblower protection laws applied to minors under certain conditions, especially when systemic harm was involved. Still, the outcome remained uncertain. Juries were unpredictable. Sympathy wasn't the same as justice, and defamation law had long favored those in power, especially when institutional reputation was involved. The closing arguments were delivered with fire on both sides. Harwood's lawyers warned that if she wasn't held accountable, no educator would be safe from student-led digital mobs. Jania's attorneys responded by saying, "The only danger here is what happens when children speak truth and adults try to ruin them for it." Then, silence. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. The gallery exhaled as one. Jania stepped outside the courtroom, into a hallway washed in fluorescent light. Rosa was waiting for her. She hadn't let go once during the entire trial, her presence steady as a mountain behind her niece's storm. Across the hall, reporters whispered into microphones. At the far end, one of Harwood's lawyers stared at the wall like it held a different version of the future. The judge's clerk stepped out after just 20 minutes. Everyone turned. A decision this fast meant something. But what? The courtroom filled again in seconds. The judge returned. The gavel tapped once, just as the jury foreman began to stand, just as the moment of truth arrived. The courtroom door swung open with a loud creak. A man stepped inside. He wore a faded Roosevelt janitor's uniform, his ID badge barely visible beneath a heavy coat. He held a duffel bag. His shoes were worn. His face was familiar.
Mr. Keene.
The courtroom froze. The judge blinked in surprise, unsure whether to call security or pause the proceedings. But Keene raised his hand and addressed the court, stating that he had new evidence, video footage and handwritten notes from staff meetings, maintenance logs, and personal directives he had been instructed to destroy but never did. He had stayed silent until now, out of fear. But after watching the trial, after seeing Jania's strength, he couldn't be quiet any longer. The judge called an immediate recess. The jury was escorted out. Keene stepped forward, placing the bag on the evidence table. Inside were old surveillance drives, printed memos, voice recordings, one labeled staff training, PPI enforcement, spring semester. The verdict is near, but the judge halts the trial. A new witness has come forward, and the footage in his bag could unravel Roosevelt down to its foundations. The moment the courtroom doors swung closed behind the recess, the air seemed to shift, like the building exhaled after months of holding its breath. Inside, spectators rose slowly, murmurs rippling through the benches as everyone absorbed the weight of the trial's abrupt interruption. At the center of it all stood the janitor, Mr. Keene, his badge pinned over a faded uniform, a duffel bag on the table beside him. For years he had been a silent witness to corridors of injustice. Now he was the voice of truth. When the judge allowed him to proceed, his voice was quiet, even soft, but the cracks in his tone carried decades of memory. He explained that during his night shifts cleaning Roosevelt's administrative offices, he had discovered a hidden storage closet, unlike any custodial supply closet. Inside were binders, old hard drives, and notebooks, all marked with cryptic codes: PPI enforcement, target assessments, diversity control, behavioral compliance, folders with bulging contents, locked by passwords he'd secretly cracked, and devices that recorded internal meetings, camera feeds, even casual conversations among administrators. He confessed that he stayed silent because of fear for his job, fear for his family, fear of retaliation. But now, after seeing a young girl's life threatened for speaking truth, guilt overpowered fear. Then, one by one, he laid out the evidence. First, an audio file from a staff meeting 2 years ago, during which Harwood spoke plainly, not in euphemisms, not in code, but with open contempt. He described black scholarship students as diversity experiments, variables, weak links. He laughed about the exposure test, administered quietly during lunch, calling it a litmus test for their commitment, adding that those who stumble will justify tighter quotas and lower black influx next fall. The laughter echoed across the recording. The clip ended with Harwood saying, "Let the system handle them, one packet at a time." Second, a video from a surveillance camera capturing a faculty lounge conversation. 2 department heads spoke in hushed tones about scaling back outreach programs if too many black students started matching academic criteria. One said they would rather accept white students with mediocre GPAs who fit the school culture than risk another public scandal. On screen, they shared a drink and exchanged jokes about public relations headaches, as though they were discussing weather instead of lives. Third, a stack of performance logs, hundreds of pages, listing dozens of students, flagged not for behavior or grades, but for non-conforming speech patterns, unorthodox hair, intense eye contact, loose posture, improper social presentation. Some cases dated back 8 years. Students had been threatened with expulsion or forced transfers, not because they violated any written rule, but because they failed to perform whiteness on demand. As the evidence played out, the courtroom fell into heavy silence. Even Harwood's legal team, which had entered the recess with a veneer of confidence, now looked like strategists forced to scramble without a plan. The lecturer who had coached them looked pale. One associate tried to whisper something, but nothing landed. The room was too still, the truth too loud. Some jurors closed their eyes. Others stared at the exhibits, as though seeing a familiar building disassemble before them. A retired teacher in the gallery began to tremble, covering her mouth. A parent pressed her child's hand, the kid staring blank-faced at screens. Too young to weigh what it meant, but old enough to sense it was important. The whole courtroom felt small, suffocating, the way guilt does when it can't run from the light anymore. The judge raised his gavel slowly. He was older, with silver hairs at his temples, and eyes that had long since lost surprise. He cleared his throat and spoke with careful calm. The trial was to continue the next morning. Meanwhile, all evidence, physical, digital, Testimonial was sealed under court supervision. No one was allowed to leak. Phones were to remain off, records to stay secured. The weight of what was coming down the line pressed on every person in that room. As proceedings adjourned, cameras swarmed around Mr. Keene. Reporters shouted questions. Flashbulbs popped. But he simply stepped away, bag in hand, his face unreadable. He told no one where he was going. He didn't wave. He didn't celebrate. He had done what decades of fear had silenced. And now he disappeared into the noise. Another ghost from Roosevelt's archive. Outside, the crowd waiting just beyond courthouse doors pressed forward as jurors filed out. They cheered, held up signs, cried. Some formed tight circles, hugging. Others chanted quietly. Justice. Truth. No more silence. The wind caught a poster, causing it to wave like a flag. Muse fans already played clips of the audio. The laughter, the mockery, the policies laid bare. The public had heard it, and the truth had broken free. Back in the hallway, reporters cornered Harwood's lawyer. He refused comment. He tightened his lips and shifted toward a black SUV, waiting at the curb. Harwood was inside, hidden by tinted windows. On his face, in the dim light, was not shame, but anger. Cold, calculated anger. The kind that gathers power when institutions crumble. Farther down the street, a group of students unfurled a banner, reading, "Erase the silence, rewrite the story." Their faces were young, fierce, tired. They carried boxes filled with old assignments, old disciplinary notices, erased transcripts, name-stripped records. They had salvaged from lockers, dumpsters, file cabinets. These were the forgotten, the erased, the punished. And tonight, their names would be spoken. Their stories told. Inside her aunt's car, Jania sat silent, staring out the window. The city lights blurred across glass. Her mind replayed every scene. The hush of the courtroom, the weight of the folder, the fear in voices that once held power. She realized that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. For every file exposed, there were still thousands buried. For every survivor who stepped forward, there were dozens who never will. As the car slowed at a red light, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "They know you have the files. They've already started taking them down. Hurry." She didn't respond, because she knew something now. Silence was no longer an option. The jury returns, with a decision that will make history. Jania stood in front of the main entrance of Roosevelt High, the same doors she had once approached, trembling with fear. But this time, the building looked different. The brass nameplate beside the heavy oak doors no longer read, "Principal Richard Harwood." It had been replaced with polished letters spelling out the name of the new interim principal. A woman appointed by the school district, committed to reform. The morning sun glinted on the new plaque, and Jania's breath caught. For a long moment she just stared, the weight of months of struggle pressing on her chest. Then she exhaled slowly, as if exhaling every insult, every whisper, every fear that had shadowed her since her arrival. Behind her, the courtyard, once silent when she passed, alive with smirks, sideways glances, whispered remarks about her kind, now buzzed with activity. Students of all backgrounds mingled. Black, Latino, white, Asian, each group as accepted as the next. A banner hung across the arch near the entrance. Roosevelt High, united, respectful, equal. Underneath, someone had scrawled in neat letters, "Let her learn." Jania's lips curved into a tentative smile. She could almost hear, in that quiet moment, the ghost of her mother's voice. "Stand tall, Janie." Inside the school, in the main hall where lockers once rattled in ominous silence as she walked past them alone, now echoed laughter, chatter, and a hum of new energy. Teachers greeted students with warmth. Administrators walked the halls with open presence instead of surveillance. Somewhere down the corridor, a new bulletin board announced the passing of the Tasha Freeman Bill, a new policy named after her late mother, forbidding any form of racially targeted testing or monitoring. Under the headline, bold letters stated, "All assessments must be equitable and open to all students." Jania felt the full force of triumph, but also a strange softness, as if the building itself exhaled in relief. She ran a finger across the letters FREEDOM, etched into the plaque on the wall beneath the banner. Inside the small office assigned to her, a modest room with a single window facing the yard, she placed a simple wooden desk where her mother's leather-bound journal lay, open to the first page. She had chosen this room intentionally, a place that once symbolized surveillance, scrutiny, silent suspicion, would now become a space for learning, reflection, growth. A bookmark peeped from the journal, the first passage reading, "They can silence a voice, but not a truth." A knock interrupted her reverie. She looked up to see Ms. Ramirez, a gentle-faced teacher, who had quietly supported her since the scandal first broke, stepping in. "Congratulations, Genia," Ms. Ramirez said softly, her eyes bright. Behind her trailed two other teachers, Mr. Singh and Mrs. Wu, people who had publicly endorsed the reforms, demanded fairness, who'd signed petitions, demanded board investigations. "Thank you," Genia said, her voice low but steady. "I didn't do this alone." Ms. Ramirez reached out, placing a hand on Genia's shoulder. "None of us did. The whole school changed, because you didn't stay silent." There was pride in Miss Ramirez's eyes, but also something else. Pain, memory, the weight of what so many before dared not challenge. Genia nodded, swallowing back the ache that memory stirred. Of late-night tears, of silent dinners after threats, of the dread in her mother's imagined face before the world went dark for her. The next days passed in a blur of reforms. The old disciplinary matrix, the one that penalized non-standard dialect, that judged appearance and accent, that gamed grading according to racially coded standards, was shredded. Grading criteria replaced with objective points, rubrics based on performance, not prejudice. Teachers attended workshops on bias, micro-insults, the history of inequality in schooling. A restorative justice program was launched. Black students who'd been unfairly punished were invited back, offered re-evaluation, support, new opportunities. For Genia, the biggest shift came when the principal's office, the heart of surveillance, changed its door sign from a torticide personnel only to student advocacy office. Each weekday, the newly hired student advocates, counselors trained in equity and empathy, sat behind desks ready to listen, and students came, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, to report incidents they'd previously swallowed in silence. Whispers turned into voices, voices turned into demand, demand turned into change. Television cameras came to campus for follow-up stories. Local journalists interviewed alumni, current students, parents. The mood in the town changed. No longer was Roosevelt High the prestige school, whose whiteness was unspoken, but enforced. It became a symbol, a school that chose justice over legacy, fairness over favoritism. Yet amid this transformation, something unexpected happened. Not everyone was happy. A shadow loomed in whispers. The prestige parents, alumni with long lineages at Roosevelt, with their important names, deep pockets and influence, felt threat. They had already lobbied against the bill, arguing it would lower standards, that targeting testing and monitoring was just discipline. Some even withdrew financial support. Some threatened lawsuits arguing that the reforms violated unspecified rights. One chilly evening, as Genia walked to her car, after staying late in her office, she found an envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Her heart pounded. She glanced around. Streetlights flickered, the shadows deep between parked cars. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed cold, impersonal. It read, "Some truths are more dangerous than lies. You don't know what's coming. Be careful." Her hands trembled so hard, she almost dropped it. She stared at the words as though they burned. Then, slowly, she crumpled it and dropped it to the ground. She didn't run, she didn't panic. She simply looked up at the dark sky, pulled the hood of her sweatshirt over her head, and walked away. That night, in her small apartment across town, she sat at the wooden desk she had reclaimed from the office. The leather-bound journal lay open again before her. She picked up a pen and wrote the first lines of what she felt deep in her bones. Her mother's name, the year she fought and lost a battle no one cared to document publicly. The injustice, the shame, the silence, and now, the fight that finally forced the system to change. In that moment, her own mother's words echoed with new weight, and Genia made a silent vow. "I will finish what you started." Months passed. Graduation came. Students walked across the stage with pride, regardless of the color of their skin, their accent, their background. For the first time in decades, the valedictorian was a black girl, a freshman scholarship student, who'd endured more than most. As applause thundered through the auditorium, cameras flashed, and Genia's eyes glistened with tears, not just of victory but of release. After the ceremony, students approached her. Some gave hugs, some shook her hand, others whispered, "Thank you." But one boy, A senior whose face was familiar from those early days of suspicion came forward. He looked ashamed, but sincere. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Back then, I didn't know better. You changed this school for all of us." His apology carried weight. In his eyes she saw regret, yes, but also hope. The transformation wasn't only institutional. It had seeped into hearts. In her final public appearance at the school courtyard, flanked by supportive teachers, fellow students, and local press, Jania took the microphone. The wind caught the banner overhead. "Let her learn." Her voice was calm, firm. "The school tried to break me," she began, staring out at the sea of faces. "Tried to turn me into a statistic, a quota, but I refused to stay small. I refused to be someone's experiment. My mother believed education could save you, even if the world tried to steal your dignity. She paid the price. Tonight I stand for her, for every student who was silenced, scored down for the color of their skin, their voice, their accent. We are more than data. We are people. We are worthy." A hush fell. Then applause began. Soft at first, then building until it shook the courtyard. She looked out at students of all colors, heights, voices, and she realized she hadn't won just for herself. She had helped build a space where children like her mother's daughter could walk without fear. In the crowd, Ms. Ramirez and Mr. Singh clasped each other's hands. Parents of color wept quietly. Local news cameras whirred, capturing the moment. And somewhere in the back, a small girl, maybe a freshman scholarship student like Jania, had once been watched wide-eyed, as if seeing possibility for the first time. Jania held up a piece of paper, the signed copy of the new school policy, the Tasha Freeman bill. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters shouted questions. In that instant, the world felt alive, hopeful, dangerous, as though the next step could be upward or downward, but finally hers to decide. She folded the paper and tucked it into the leather journal. Then she closed the journal, snapped it shut. The finality of the click rang in her ears like a promise. But just as she stepped off the stage and made her way toward the crowd, a new silence, heavier than before, settled. A hush so deep that even the breeze seemed to pause. Her phone buzzed. A single notification, an email. She unlocked it, browsed. The sender address was strange, unfamiliar. The subject line was chilling. "Do you really want everyone to read that story?" Without opening the message, she felt a cold prickle crawl up her spine. Not fear exactly, but wariness, sharp and insistent. She paused, pressed her palm against the doorframe of the old main office building. Now reimagined. A gathering crowd pushed forward, laughing, celebrating, hopeful. But behind her, in that silent doorway, shadows gathered. The memory of threats, whispers, danger, long buried, rose faintly again. She looked down at her phone. One tap stood between her and a secret someone wanted kept hidden. Between silence and the truth. Her heart pounded. With a slow breath she pressed open. And when they do, the world will watch. As the foundation of Roosevelt finally cracks open. If you believe no student should ever be humiliated just for trying to learn, type yes in the comments. Have you or someone you know ever faced unfair treatment in school or work, simply for being who you are? Share your story below. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that expose the injustice too many still face. Because silence protects systems, but truth protects the future.